In the autumn of 1823, the small Pennsylvania town of Millbrook recorded 17 unexplained deaths in just 3 months. What made these deaths particularly disturbing wasn't their number, but the fact that the same family-owned funeral home had prepared every single victim for burial. For over 2 decades, the Hartwell Funeral Parlor had served the community, earning a reputation for their compassionate treatment of grieving families and their meticulous care of the deceased. But during a routine health inspection, a traveling physician noticed peculiar marks on several bodies, uncovering evidence that would shake the foundations of this quiet Pennsylvania town. What authorities discovered in the basement of the Hartwell establishment was so horrifying that local officials buried the records for nearly a century. And some say the full truth has never been told. Before we continue with the story of the Hartwell family and their house of horrors. If dark historical mysteries like this one fascinate you, make sure to hit that notification bell and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most chilling true stories from America's past. Also, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers worldwide. But let me take you back to the Pennsylvania countryside of 1823, where the Hartwell family had built what appeared to be a respectable business on a foundation of unimaginable darkness. Nestled in the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, Millbrook was a community of barely 300 souls who made their living from logging, farming, and the occasional travelers who stopped at the town's single inn. The year 1823 marked a period of growth for the young American Republic. But small towns like Millbrook remained largely isolated from the bustling cities of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Here, neighbors knew each other's business, children played freely in the streets, and the currency that held the community together was trust. The Hartwell family had arrived in Millbrook in 1801 when Patriarch Ezekiel Hartwell purchased a large stone house on the outskirts of town and established the area's first dedicated funeral parlor. Before the Hartwells, families had prepared their own dead or relied on the local carpenter to build coffins. Initially viewed with suspicion by some townspeople, Ezekiel's professional approach to death care quickly won over the community with his respectful manner and fair prices. Ezekiel lived in the funeral home with his wife Martha, their 3 children, sons Josiah and Caleb, and daughter Rebecca, and Martha's elderly father, Thomas Creed. The family appeared to embody the Protestant work ethic that defined rural Pennsylvania. They attended Sunday services at the Methodist Church, participated in community barn raisings, and Martha was known for bringing pies to families experiencing hardship. The elder son, Josiah, at 26, had learned the embalming trade from his father and was expected to inherit the business. Caleb, 23, assisted with carpentry and grave digging. Rebecca, just 19, helped her mother with domestic duties and often comforted grieving families with her gentle manner. The Hartwell establishment occupied a 3-story stone building with a wooden addition that housed the preparation rooms. The main floor served as both the family's living quarters and the viewing area for deceased loved ones. A narrow staircase led to the 2nd floor where the family's bedrooms were located, while another set of stairs descended to a basement converted into the embalming and storage area. The property also included a large barn where coffins were constructed and a small cemetery plot for those who couldn't afford burial elsewhere. What made the Hartwells particularly trusted in the community was their willingness to serve families regardless of their ability to pay. During harsh winters when crops failed, they often provided services in exchange for food or future labor. This generosity created a network of grateful families throughout the region, and word of their compassionate service spread to neighboring towns. By 1823, the Hartwell Funeral Parlor was handling nearly every death within a 15-mile radius. The political climate of 1823 Pennsylvania was marked by tensions between traditional rural values and the encroaching influence of industrial progress. Nearing completion in New York, the Erie Canal promised to bring unprecedented economic opportunity to the region, but also threatened to disrupt the established order of small-town life. Religious revival movements swept through Pennsylvania communities, bringing both spiritual renewal and social upheaval as traditional authority structures were questioned. In this atmosphere of change and uncertainty, institutions like the Hartwell Funeral Parlor represented stability and continuity. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, something sinister was taking root in the Hartwell household. The isolation of their work, the trust placed in them by grieving families, and the very nature of their profession created opportunities that most people could never imagine. Death had become not just their livelihood, but their obsession. And the line between caring for the dead and creating them was about to be crossed in ways that would horrify anyone who discovered the truth. The first sign that something was amiss came on October 15, 1823, when Dr. Samuel Harrison arrived in Millbrook to conduct his annual health inspection of the surrounding townships. A traveling physician employed by the state, Dr. Harrison was tasked with monitoring disease outbreaks and ensuring that proper sanitary practices were being followed in rural communities. His visits were routine affairs, typically involving examinations of water sources, food storage facilities, and burial practices. What drew Dr. Harrison's attention wasn't initially the number of recent deaths in Millbrook, but rather the unusual circumstances he observed during his mandatory inspection of the Hartwell funeral parlor. Required by Pennsylvania law was that all bodies be available for medical examination if requested by a state physician, a regulation implemented following several cholera outbreaks in the previous decade. When Dr. Harrison arrived at the Hartwell establishment on that crisp autumn morning, he was greeted warmly by Ezekiel Hartwell and his son Josiah. The two men gave him a tour of their facilities, proudly displaying their modern embalming equipment and meticulously clean preparation rooms. Everything appeared to be in order until Dr. Harrison requested to examine 3 bodies currently in their care, preparing for burial services later that week. The first body belonged to Eleanor Fairchild, a 68-year-old widow who had allegedly died of consumption 3 days earlier. As Dr. Harrison conducted his examination, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Along Eleanor's neck, barely visible beneath the high collar of her burial dress, were faint but unmistakable bruise marks. The pattern was consistent with manual strangulation, not the wasting disease that had supposedly claimed her life. When Dr. Harrison questioned the marks, Josiah Hartwell quickly explained that they had positioned Eleanor awkwardly during the embalming process, causing postmortem bruising. Plausible enough seemed the explanation, but something in Josiah's manner, a slight tremor in his voice, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, made Dr. Harrison decide to examine the other 2 bodies more carefully. The second body was that of Marcus Webb, a healthy 42-year-old farmer who had allegedly suffered a heart attack while working in his fields. Something even more disturbing was revealed by Dr. Harrison's examination: small puncture wounds on Webb's arms and chest, precisely placed and too deliberate to be accidental. When pressed for an explanation, Ezekiel Hartwell claimed that Webb had fallen onto some farming tools during his collapse, but the wounds were too clean and purposeful for such a random accident. The third body provided the most damning evidence. Mary Patterson, a 26-year-old mother of 2, had supposedly died of a fever after a brief illness. However, discovered by Dr. Harrison were traces of a white powder residue around her mouth and fingernails. His medical training immediately recognized the substance as arsenic, a poison unfortunately common in rural areas where it was used to control rodent populations. As Dr. Harrison documented his findings, he became aware of an oppressive atmosphere within the Hartwell establishment. Meaningful glances were exchanged by the family members, their earlier warmth replaced by a cold watchfulness. Martha Hartwell, who had been preparing tea in the kitchen, appeared in the doorway with an expression that could only be described as predatory. Even young Rebecca, who had seemed so innocent, watched the proceedings with eyes that held knowledge far beyond her years. The basement preparation room, which Dr. Harrison insisted on examining more thoroughly, revealed additional disturbing details. Along one wall stood several large glass containers filled with various chemical solutions, some containing what appeared to be human organs preserved for unknown purposes. When questioned about these specimens, Ezekiel claimed they were for educational purposes to better understand the diseases that claimed their clients' lives. But the organs appeared fresh, and some had been sectioned with a surgical precision that seemed unnecessary for simple preservation. Most unsettling of all was a leather-bound journal that Dr. Harrison noticed partially hidden beneath a stack of burial clothes. Before he could examine it more closely, Caleb Hartwell quickly moved to block his view, claiming it contained private family records. But in the brief glimpse Dr. Harrison caught, he saw what appeared to be detailed notes about various individuals in the community, including information about their health, their family situations, and their financial circumstances. As the examination concluded, Dr. Harrison found himself in a difficult position. His medical training told him that at least 3 of the recent deaths showed signs of foul play, but his evidence was circumstantial and the Hartwell family was respected throughout the community. Moreover, as an outsider conducting a routine inspection, his accusations would be met with skepticism by local authorities who had known and trusted the Hartwells for over 2 decades. That evening, as Dr. Harrison prepared his preliminary report at the Millbrook Inn, he was approached by several townspeople who had heard about his visit to the funeral parlor. Their conversations revealed a pattern that chilled him to the bone. In hushed tones, they spoke of the unusual number of recent deaths, the way healthy individuals seemed to suddenly fall ill and die within days, and the almost eager way the Hartwell family responded to news of someone's declining health. One particularly disturbing account came from Sarah Peaton, whose elderly mother had died just 2 weeks earlier. Sarah confided that her mother had been in good health and spirits until Martha Hartwell began visiting regularly, bringing homemade soup and offering comfort during a minor bout of joint pain. Within 3 days of these visits, the elderly woman had fallen violently ill and died before a doctor could be summoned. The Hartwell family had immediately offered their services, waiving their usual fee out of apparent compassion. Dr. Harrison's disturbing discoveries in Millbrook were not the first time questions had been raised about the Hartwell family's practices, though previous concerns had been dismissed or forgotten by a trusting community. As he delved deeper into the family's history, a pattern of suspicious deaths began to emerge that stretched back to their very arrival in Pennsylvania over 2 decades earlier. The Hartwells had come to Millbrook from Western Virginia in 1801, claiming that Ezekiel had learned the funeral trade from an uncle in Richmond. They had purchased their property from the estate of a recently deceased landowner, paying in gold coins that seemed unusually abundant for a family claiming modest means. Local records from that time showed that their first winter in Millbrook had been marked by an outbreak of what was described as a wasting sickness that claimed 8 lives, all of whom were prepared for burial by the newly established Hartwell funeral parlor. Over the years, townspeople had occasionally remarked on certain peculiarities surrounding deaths that occurred when the Hartwells were involved. Families would later comment on how quickly their loved ones seemed to decline once the Hartwells began offering assistance, how eager the family was to handle all arrangements, and how they discouraged second medical opinions or delays in burial. But in a close-knit community where the Hartwells had proven themselves generous and caring, such observations were dismissed as the natural suspicions that sometimes accompany grief. The basement of the Hartwell establishment held secrets that would have horrified the community had they been discovered. Behind a false wall that Dr. Harrison had not detected during his inspection, the family maintained what could only be described as a laboratory of death, shelves lined with various poisons, surgical instruments far more sophisticated than any funeral preparation would require, and detailed anatomical drawings that suggested experiments going far beyond the simple care of the deceased. Most damning of all was the complete version of the journal that Dr. Harrison had glimpsed. This leather-bound tome contained meticulous records of every person who had died in their care along with detailed observations about the effectiveness of various methods and substances. The entries, written in multiple hands over many years, revealed a systematic approach to murder that had been refined through careful practice and observation. The journal documented not just the methods of killing but the careful selection of victims. The Hartwells had developed a sophisticated understanding of their community, identifying individuals whose deaths would be mourned but not extensively investigated. Preferred targets were elderly people with few relatives, individuals with existing health problems, and those who had fallen on hard times. The family had also learned to space their activities, ensuring that no pattern would be obvious to casual observation. One particularly chilling entry, written in Josiah's careful script, described the murder of Marcus Webb in clinical detail. Webb had been selected because he was a widower with no close family and because his farm bordered the Hartwell property, making it convenient to dispose of evidence. The entry noted that Webb had been lured to the funeral home under the pretense of discussing the purchase of a coffin for a recently deceased neighbor. Once there, he had been overpowered and subjected to what the journal euphemistically termed experimental procedures before being killed and his body staged to suggest a heart attack. The family's motivation appeared to be a complex mixture of financial gain, psychological satisfaction, and what could only be described as scientific curiosity about death and dying. They regularly robbed their victims of money and valuables, but this seemed secondary to their apparent fascination with the process of causing and observing death. Several journal entries discussed their experiments with different poisons, their observations of how various individuals reacted to fear and pain, and their attempts to perfect methods that would leave no obvious evidence of foul play. From the journal entries, Martha Hartwell emerged as perhaps the most cunning member of the family. Her specialty was befriending isolated or vulnerable community members, gradually gaining their trust before introducing poisons into food or drink she prepared for them. Her matronly appearance and reputation for kindness made her the perfect predator, able to approach potential victims without arousing suspicion. The children had been gradually inducted into the family's activities as they matured. Rebecca, despite her youth and innocent appearance, had become skilled at identifying potential victims during social gatherings, reporting back to her family about individuals who seemed lonely, ill, or financially distressed. Both sons had developed expertise in the physical aspects of murder, learning to overpower victims and stage crime scenes to avoid detection. What made the Hartwell operation particularly sinister was their integration into the community's social fabric. They attended church services, participated in town meetings, and maintained friendships with many of the same people they were systematically murdering. This dual existence required a level of psychological compartmentalization that suggested either inherent psychopathy or a gradual descent into madness that had consumed the entire family. The autumn of 1823 had marked an escalation in their activities, driven by both opportunity and growing confidence. The previous winter had been harsh, leaving many families in financial distress and vulnerable to the Hartwells' offers of assistance. At the same time, the family's success in avoiding detection had made them increasingly bold, leading to the accelerated timeline that had finally attracted Dr. Harrison's attention. Dr. Harrison faced a dilemma that would test both his professional integrity and personal courage. His medical examination had revealed clear evidence of foul play, but presenting his findings to local authorities would require him to accuse a respected family of systematic murder, a charge that would seem incredible to a community that had trusted the Hartwells for over 2 decades. Moreover, Dr. Harrison was scheduled to continue his inspection tour to neighboring townships within days, and delaying his departure would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give. The solution came from an unexpected source. On his second evening in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison was approached by Thomas Creed, Martha Hartwell's elderly father, who requested a private medical consultation. The old man claimed to be suffering from severe stomach pains and asked Dr. Harrison to examine him away from the funeral home. They met in the stable behind the inn, where Creed's demeanor immediately transformed from that of a feeble patient to something far more calculating. "Doctor," Creed whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the street, "I know what you found during your examination today. The marks, the poison, the wounds that don't match the claimed causes of death. You're right to be suspicious, but you don't understand the full scope of what's happening in that house." What Thomas Creed revealed to Dr. Harrison over the next hour painted a picture of evil that exceeded even the physician's growing suspicions. Creed explained that he had been gradually poisoned by his own family over the past several months, experiencing the same symptoms that had preceded the deaths of several recent victims. His advanced age and declining health had made him an ideal test subject for the family's experiments, but his survival instinct and knowledge of their methods had allowed him to identify and counteract their attempts on his life. According to Creed, the family's activities had begun as simple grave robbing. Shortly after their arrival in Millbrook, Ezekiel had discovered that freshly buried bodies could be exhumed and stripped of valuable jewelry, gold teeth, and burial clothes that could be resold in distant communities. This initial criminal activity had gradually evolved into something far more sinister as the family realized that they could increase their profits by creating their own supply of bodies. The turning point had come in 1807 when the family had accidentally caused the death of a gravely ill man they were attempting to rob. Rather than face exposure, they had covered up the crime and discovered that their victim's death was readily accepted by the community as a natural progression of his illness. This success had led to increasingly bold experiments in murder, with each family member developing specialized skills and roles in their expanding operation. Creed revealed that the basement laboratory contained detailed records of over 40 murders committed over the past 16 years, with victims carefully selected from throughout the region to avoid detection. The family had developed a network of contacts in neighboring towns who would alert them to potential targets, isolated individuals, travelers, or anyone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. What made Creed's testimony particularly credible was his intimate knowledge of the family's methods and his ability to provide specific details about recent victims that Dr. Harrison had examined. He described exactly how Eleanor Fairchild had been strangled, how Marcus Webb had been tortured before his death, and how Mary Patterson had been gradually poisoned over several weeks while Martha pretended to nurse her through a fictional illness. The old man also revealed the existence of a mass grave hidden in the woods behind the Hartwell property where the family disposed of victims whose bodies couldn't be passed off as natural deaths. This burial site contained the remains of at least a dozen individuals, including several travelers who had stopped at the funeral home seeking directions or shelter and had never been seen again. Creed's motivation for betraying his family was both personal and practical. He had grown increasingly horrified by their activities, but more importantly, he had realized that his own death was imminent. The family had grown tired of supporting him, and recent conversations had made it clear that his usefulness as a test subject was nearing its end. His only hope for survival was to expose their crimes and seek protection from authorities. The old man proposed a plan that would allow Dr. Harrison to gather irrefutable evidence while protecting both of them from immediate retaliation. Creed would provide the physician with the key to the basement laboratory, allowing him to examine the hidden records and evidence during the family's absence at Sunday church services. This would give Dr. Harrison the documentation he needed to convince authorities, while Creed would use the same opportunity to escape to a distant relative's home in Philadelphia. Dr. Harrison spent the remainder of the night wrestling with the implications of Creed's revelations. The scope of the crimes was staggering, involving dozens of murders committed over nearly 2 decades by a family that had been trusted and respected by their entire community. The evidence Creed promised would likely be sufficient to secure convictions, but it would also destroy the faith and security of hundreds of innocent people who had believed themselves safe in their small town. More troubling was the realization that Dr. Harrison himself was now in danger. His examination of the bodies had clearly aroused the family's suspicions, and his continued presence in Millbrook represented a threat to their operation. Creed warned that the family had killed to protect their secrets before, and they would not hesitate to do so again if they felt cornered. The plan they devised required precise timing and considerable courage. Dr. Harrison would need to gain access to the basement laboratory, document the evidence he found there, and escape Millbrook before the family realized what had occurred. Meanwhile, Creed would disappear during the same time period, making it appear that he had simply wandered off in his senile confusion, a disappearance that would be tragic, but not immediately suspicious. Sunday morning dawned grey and cold with a November chill that seemed to penetrate the very bones of Millbrook's residents as they prepared for weekly worship services. Dr. Harrison had spent a sleepless night at the inn, alternately reviewing his medical notes and questioning the sanity of the plan he had agreed to undertake. The weight of potential evidence hidden in the Hartwell basement pressed on his mind like a physical burden, made heavier by the knowledge that his own life now hung in the balance. Thomas Creed had provided him with detailed instructions for accessing the basement laboratory during the family's absence at church. The Hartwells, as prominent members of the Methodist congregation, never missed Sunday services and typically remained for social activities that extended well into the afternoon. This would provide Dr. Harrison with approximately 3 hours to locate and document the evidence Creed had described. The key Creed had given him was small and ornate, designed to open a hidden compartment behind the basement stone wall. According to the old man, this compartment contained not only the complete murder journal but also preserved specimens, poison supplies, and detailed anatomical drawings that would provide irrefutable proof of the family's crimes. More importantly, it contained a detailed map showing the location of the hidden burial ground where dozens of victims had been disposed of over the years. As the church bells began to ring across Millbrook, Dr. Harrison positioned himself in the woods behind the Hartwell property, watching the family emerge from their home dressed in their Sunday finest. Ezekiel wore a black suit that gave him a dignified ministerial appearance, while Martha had chosen a dark blue dress with a white collar that emphasized her matronly respectability. Josiah and Caleb flanked their parents, looking every inch the devoted sons, while Rebecca walked demurely beside her mother, her innocent appearance masking the calculating mind that Creed had described. What Dr. Harrison found most disturbing was how normal the family appeared as they walked toward the church. Their faces showed no trace of the evil that Creed had described, no hint that they had murdered dozens of innocent people over the past 2 decades. They exchanged pleasantries with neighbors along the way, smiled at children playing in yards, and presented themselves as the very model of Christian virtue and family values. The physician waited a full 30 minutes after the family's departure before approaching the funeral home. The building stood silent and imposing in the weak autumn sunlight, its stone walls holding secrets that would shock the entire community if they were revealed. Dr. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he used Thomas Creed's key to enter through the basement door, but his medical training had prepared him for confronting disturbing realities, and he forced himself to proceed methodically. The basement initially appeared exactly as it had during his official inspection, clean, organized, and professionally maintained. The embalming tables were spotless, the chemical solutions properly labeled and stored, and the few bodies currently in their care lay peacefully under white sheets. It was only when Dr. Harrison began examining the walls more carefully that he located the concealed entrance Creed had described. Behind a section of stone wall that appeared identical to the rest of the basement, the small key opened a hidden panel that revealed a chamber of horrors beyond his worst imaginings. The secret room was larger than the main basement, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house and into the hillside beyond. Shelves lined the walls containing hundreds of glass jars filled with preserved human organs, each carefully labeled with dates and what appeared to be experimental notations. The murder journal occupied a place of honor on a wooden lectern in the center of the room. The leather-bound volume was thick with years of entries written in multiple hands, but with consistent attention to detail that spoke of scientific methodology applied to the act of murder. Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to understand the technical aspects of what he was reading, but the clinical precision with which the family had documented their crimes was perhaps more horrifying than the murders themselves. Each entry followed a similar format: identification of the victim, method of approach, technique employed for killing, observations about the victim's reactions, and notes for future reference. The entries revealed a progression from simple poisonings to increasingly sophisticated methods that suggested years of practice and refinement. Recent entries showed experiments with various surgical techniques, apparently conducted on living victims to study their effects. What shocked Dr. Harrison most was the discovery that the family's activities extended far beyond Millbrook. The journal documented murders in at least 6 different Pennsylvania townships, with victims selected during the family's travels to provide funeral services for distant clients. They had developed a system for identifying vulnerable individuals in each community, often returning months later to commit crimes in areas where they were less likely to be suspected. The anatomical drawings were even more disturbing than the journal entries. Detailed illustrations showed the progression of various experimental procedures, with careful notations about which techniques produced the most fear in victims and which methods were most effective for different types of people. The drawing suggested that the family viewed their victims not as human beings but as subjects for scientific study, approaching murder with the same methodical precision that legitimate researchers might apply to animal specimens. As Dr. Harrison continued his examination of the hidden chamber, he became aware of voices outside the building. Glancing at his pocket watch, he realized with growing alarm that he had been in the basement for over 2 hours, absorbed in documenting the evidence he had discovered. The voices grew louder, and he recognized the distinctive cadence of Ezekiel Hartwell's speech as the family returned from church much earlier than expected. Panic seized Dr. Harrison as he realized his precarious situation. He was trapped in the secret chamber with damning evidence of the family's crimes, and they would certainly kill him if they discovered his presence. The voices moved closer to the building, and he could hear footsteps on the wooden porch above his head. His escape route through the basement door would take him directly into their path, but remaining hidden in the chamber would only delay his discovery until they came to check on their secrets. Just when we thought Dr. Harrison's investigation might expose the horrible truth about the Hartwell family, the situation takes a deadly turn. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this house of horrors. In his desperate search for an alternative escape route, Dr. Harrison noticed that the secret chamber extended further than he had initially realized. At the far end of the room, partially concealed behind stacks of glass specimen jars, was another door that appeared to lead deeper into the hillside. With the family's voices growing ever closer, he had no choice but to risk exploring this unknown passage, hoping it might lead to freedom rather than deeper into the nightmare he had uncovered. The narrow passage behind the specimen chamber led Dr. Harrison through a hand-carved tunnel that extended deep into the hillside behind the Hartwell property. The walls were rough stone, carved with simple tools but showing evidence of years of gradual expansion. As he moved through the tunnel by the light of a candle he had found in the chamber, the physician began to understand the true scope of the Hartwell family's operation. The tunnel opened into a natural cave that had been converted into what could only be described as a charnel house. Human remains were scattered throughout the cavern, some carefully arranged on stone shelves, others simply piled in corners where they had been hastily discarded. The smell of death and decay was overwhelming, but Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to examine the scene with professional detachment, despite his horror. What he discovered in that underground cemetery revealed the full extent of the family's crimes. The remains of at least 40 individuals were present in various states of decay, representing decades of systematic murder. Some of the bodies showed evidence of the experimental procedures documented in the journal, while others appeared to have been killed quickly and efficiently. Personal effects scattered among the remains, or jewelry, clothing, coins, suggested that robbery had indeed been a significant motivation for many of the murders. Most disturbing of all was a section of the cave where recent victims had been displayed almost like trophies. Dr. Harrison recognized clothing and jewelry belonging to several individuals he had examined during his official inspection, confirming that the Hartwells had been systematically murdering their clients rather than simply preparing natural deaths for burial. The clinical arrangement of these bodies suggested that the family visited this underground chamber regularly, perhaps to relive their crimes or to continue their grotesque experiments. As Dr. Harrison documented what he found in the cave, he heard voices echoing through the tunnel behind him. The Hartwells had discovered his absence from the inn and had apparently found evidence of his intrusion into their secret chamber. Multiple voices called his name, but their tone was not one of concern. It was the patient, predatory sound of hunters pursuing cornered prey. The cave system proved to have multiple exits, and Dr. Harrison managed to escape through a narrow opening that led to the wooded hillside above the Hartwell property. From this vantage point, he could see the family searching the area around their home, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had conducted such searches before. It became clear that Dr. Harrison was not the first person to discover their secrets, and the methodical way they combed the area suggested that previous investigators had not survived their discoveries. The physician's escape from Millbrook required all his knowledge of wilderness survival and considerable luck. He was forced to abandon his belongings at the inn and travel cross-country toward the nearest substantial town, avoiding roads where the Hartwells might pursue him. His medical bag contained enough documentation to convince authorities, but he needed to reach civilized areas before the family could silence him permanently. What Dr. Harrison didn't know was that Thomas Creed had not escaped as planned. The old man had been discovered attempting to leave the house and had been confronted by his family about his betrayal. Under torture, Creed had revealed everything about his arrangement with Dr. Harrison, including the physician's plans to document their crimes and expose them to authorities. This revelation had prompted the family to return early from church and begin their search for Dr. Harrison. More ominously, it had convinced them that their operation in Millbrook was no longer sustainable. Rather than simply eliminating Dr. Harrison and continuing their activities, they had decided to abandon their established base and relocate to a new community where they could start fresh. The Hartwells' departure from Millbrook was as carefully planned as their crimes had been. They claimed that Ezekiel had received an urgent message about a dying relative in Ohio, necessitating an immediate journey that might keep them away for several months. The funeral home would be temporarily closed, and they asked neighbors to keep watch over their property during their absence. To most of the community, this seemed like a reasonable family emergency that required their sympathy and support. What the townspeople didn't realize was that the Hartwells were methodically destroying evidence of their crimes before leaving. The secret chamber was emptied and sealed, the cave system was partially collapsed to hide the remains it contained, and all documentary evidence of their activities was either destroyed or packed for transport to their new location. By the time Dr. Harrison reached authorities in Philadelphia 3 days later, the Hartwell family had vanished completely, leaving behind only an empty funeral home and a community that would never suspect the horrors that had been committed in their midst. Dr. Harrison's account of what he had discovered was met with skepticism by Philadelphia authorities, who found it difficult to believe that a respected family could have committed such extensive crimes without detection. The physician's evidence was compelling, but much of it had been destroyed or hidden by the time investigators reached Millbrook. The few remains they managed to recover from the partially collapsed cave system were insufficient to support the full scope of Dr. Harrison's accusations. The investigation that followed was hampered by the community's resistance to believing such terrible things about the Hartwell family. Townspeople provided character references for the Hartwells, insisting that they had been generous, caring neighbors who could never have committed the crimes Dr. Harrison described. Without the family present to question and with most physical evidence destroyed, authorities were forced to conclude that while suspicious circumstances existed, there was insufficient proof to warrant a massive manhunt. Thomas Creed's disappearance was explained by the family as the wandering of a senile old man who had become confused and lost in the woods. Search parties found no trace of him, and his fate remained officially unknown, though Dr. Harrison had no doubt that Creed had paid the ultimate price for his attempt to expose his family's crimes. The aftermath of Dr. Harrison's discoveries haunted both him and the community of Millbrook for years to come. The physician submitted detailed reports to state authorities, but without the Hartwell family present to question and with most physical evidence destroyed, the case was eventually classified as inconclusive and filed away in the growing bureaucracy of the Pennsylvania state government. Dr. Harrison never stopped believing in what he had witnessed, and he spent considerable personal resources attempting to track down the Hartwell family. His investigations revealed a pattern of similar disappearances and suspicious deaths in several Ohio communities during 1824 and 1825, but by the time he could alert authorities in those areas, the family had once again vanished. Over the following decade, Dr. Harrison documented similar patterns in Indiana, Illinois, and eventually the Missouri Territory, always arriving too late to prevent further murders or capture the perpetrators. The people of Millbrook were left to grapple with the possibility that they had been living alongside systematic murderers for over 2 decades. Some residents refused to believe Dr. Harrison's account, insisting that the Hartwells had been good neighbors who were being falsely accused. Others began to re-examine past deaths with new suspicion, wondering how many of their friends and relatives had actually been murdered rather than claimed by natural causes. The Hartwell funeral parlor building stood empty for nearly 2 years before being purchased by a merchant from Philadelphia who converted it into a general store. Local residents were reluctant to enter the building, and it took years for the community to fully accept its new function. The basement was permanently sealed, and no one showed any interest in exploring the cave system that Dr. Harrison had described. Perhaps most tragically, the fear and suspicion created by the Hartwell affair fundamentally changed the character of Millbrook. The trust and openness that had defined the community for generations was replaced by weariness and doubt. Neighbors began viewing each other with suspicion, death became a source of fear rather than acceptance, and the simple faith that had bound the community together was permanently fractured. Dr. Harrison continued his work as a traveling physician, but he was forever changed by what he had witnessed in Millbrook. He developed an almost obsessive attention to detail during his inspections, examining every death with the thoroughness of a criminal investigator rather than a routine health official. His colleagues began to view him as eccentric, even paranoid, but Dr. Harrison knew that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. In 1847, nearly 24 years after his experience in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison received a letter that would vindicate his long-held beliefs and provide a final chilling chapter to the Hartwell story. The letter came from a sheriff in Oregon Territory, where westward expansion had carried thousands of settlers seeking new opportunities in the far reaches of the American frontier. According to the sheriff's account, a family named Caldwell had operated a funeral parlor in a small Oregon settlement for 3 years before being exposed in circumstances remarkably similar to what Dr. Harrison had discovered in Pennsylvania. The sheriff had read Dr. Harrison's old reports in federal files and recognized the identical patterns of suspicious deaths, systematic poisoning, and hidden burial sites. When authorities had finally raided the Caldwell establishment, they found evidence of at least 30 murders committed over their 3 years in Oregon. More significantly, they discovered documentation proving that the Caldwells were actually the Hartwell family, who had been moving westward across America for over 2 decades, establishing new identities and continuing their murderous practices in each new community. The family had been captured alive, and during their interrogation, they confessed to crimes spanning nearly 30 years and covering 8 different states. Their total victim count exceeded 120 individuals, making them among the most prolific serial killers in American history. Ezekiel Hartwell, now calling himself Ezekiel Caldwell, was 73 years old but remained mentally sharp and showed no remorse for his crimes. Martha, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca had all continued their roles in the family operation, refining their techniques and expanding their methods with each relocation. The family's confessions revealed the full scope of their crimes and provided closure for dozens of unsolved disappearances across the frontier. They described in detail how they had perfected their system of selecting victims, establishing credibility in new communities, and disposing of evidence. Most chillingly, they expressed pride in their accomplishments, viewing themselves as successful entrepreneurs who had simply chosen an unusual line of business. Ezekiel Hartwell was executed by hanging in Salem, Oregon in December 1847, followed by his wife Martha and son Josiah. Caleb was sentenced to life imprisonment where he died of pneumonia in 1852. Rebecca, who was still relatively young and claimed to have been coerced by her family, received a 20-year sentence but died in prison of unknown causes in 1851. The revelation of the Hartwell family's true scope of crime sent shockwaves through communities across America where they had operated. Families who had trusted them with their most vulnerable moments realized they had been in the presence of calculating murderers. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing blind trust in strangers, no matter how respectable they might appear. Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s, traveled to Oregon to witness Ezekiel Hartwell's execution and to finally confront the man who had haunted his thoughts for over 2 decades. The two men spoke briefly before the execution, and Hartwell expressed surprise that Dr. Harrison had survived his discovery in Millbrook, claiming that several other investigators over the years had not been so fortunate. In their final conversation, Hartwell revealed one last disturbing detail: the family had trained other individuals in their methods, apprentices who had established their own operations in various parts of the expanding nation. He claimed that at least 3 other families were continuing similar practices, but he refused to provide any details that might help authorities locate them. This revelation ensured that Dr. Harrison's remaining years would be spent in the knowledge that the evil he had discovered in Millbrook was still spreading across America. The Millbrook community never fully recovered from the revelation that their trusted neighbors had.